She was half-clothed and unconscious inside the tent. Her sister screamed her name. She didn't move. The afternoon light was dimming through the tree line at the edge of the encampment, and 5-year-old Zoey Felix was lying on the ground, completely still, the kind of stillness that makes the air around it feel wrong. Her small body was cold. Her lips were parted. A pillow lay beside her. A few feet away, a man named Mickel Cherry was standing shirtless. There was dried blood near his navel. Someone grabbed Zoey. Someone ran for help. An emergency call came into Topeka police at around 5:45 in the evening on October 2, 2023, near a Dillon's grocery store on SC 29th Street, a gas station plaza in southeast Topeka that most people only stopped at to fill their tanks. Firefighters with the Topeka Fire Department arrived first and found them already performing desperate life-saving measures on a little girl who shouldn't have been there, who shouldn't have been in a tent, who shouldn't have been in a homeless encampment in the woods, who should have been in a kindergarten classroom somewhere, drawing pictures of mermaids and asking every adult in the room 1,000 questions they had better be prepared to answer. She was rushed to the hospital. The injuries to her lower body were catastrophic. Her bladder had been damaged. The trauma was so severe, so comprehensive in its brutality, that the doctors had nothing left to offer her. Zoey Felix was pronounced dead a short time after she arrived. She was 5 years old. And the devastating, infuriating truth is this: every single adult who was supposed to protect her knew she was in danger. Her neighbors knew. Her community knew. Multiple investigators knew. And not one of them was able to stop what was coming. This is Zoey's story, and it deserves to be told in full. If you had grown up on the same block as Zoey Felix, you would have known her face before you knew her name. She had a way of appearing, materializing almost in doorways and on front porches, her clothes mismatched, her hair unbrushed, her eyes wide and electric with a kind of curiosity that lit up whatever room she walked into. She was small for her age, but she filled every space she entered. Neighbors on her southeast Topeka street described a child who was joyful, relentlessly inquisitive, and fiercely independent in the way that children are when they've had to learn to navigate the world without much adult guidance. She loved mermaids. She loved unicorns. She wore t-shirts plastered with her favorite characters and would talk your ear off about them if you gave her half the chance. She just had a good spirit to her, one neighbor told reporters. Honestly, very outgoing, smart. She was curious about everything. She'd ask you 1,001 questions, and she demanded answers for those, too. That last part is important. Zoey didn't just ask questions and move on. She waited. She wanted to know. She wanted to understand the world she had been placed in, and she had enough fire in her at 5 years old to insist on being taken seriously. The tragedy is that the people who should have taken her most seriously, her parents, the state agencies tasked with her welfare, never quite did. Because alongside that bright, burning spirit was a reality that no child should have to live. The house where Zoey had been staying with her mother, Holly Jo Felix, was, by multiple accounts, in a condition that defied description. The stench of animal waste hung in the air. There was no running water. There was no electricity. Lights didn't come on at night. Faucets didn't run. The home was, at various points, so dilapidated that it would eventually be briefly condemned by local authorities, after police were told that Zoey had been left alone inside it with a strange man, with neither utilities nor any kind of adult supervision she could trust. And yet there she was, roaming the block at all hours of the day, sometimes well after dark, stopping at neighbors' homes and asking if she could come in, asking if she could eat, asking, in the quiet and particular way of children who have learned that direct requests are more likely to be heard than indirect ones, "Can I stay? Can I stay?" Neighbor Shaniqua Bradley remembered that phrase clearly. "Normally, when a kid is persistent about staying like that," she said, "something's going on at home." Something was very much going on at home. Multiple neighbors on the block reported calling the Kansas Department for Children and Families, the state agency responsible for child welfare, commonly known as DCF, to report what they were witnessing. Neighbor Sharon Williams was one of them. "I just reported the neglect that was going on," she said later. "She's always dirty, no food unless some of us fed her, but they didn't obviously take it serious." And so the neighbors did what the agencies wouldn't. They bathed Zoey when she came to them dirty. They fed her when she came to them hungry. They opened their doors when she knocked. They gave her clean clothes, warm meals, a few hours of something that resembled stability. They didn't have the power to remove her from danger, but they did everything within their reach to soften the edges of the life she was living. As another neighbor, Mickel Cherry, put it in a statement that became one of the most haunting quotes from this entire case. "Everybody on the block took care of Zoey. Everybody loved Zoey except her parents." There is no gentler way to frame it than that. And the neighbors' love for her, as real and as fierce as it was, could not ultimately protect her from what was coming. Zoey Felix deserved so much more than the hand she was dealt. She deserved clean water and lights at night, and a bedroom with mermaid posters on the wall and a parent who tucked her in and answered all 1,001 of her questions. She deserved a kindergarten teacher who would have seen that spark in her and recognized it for what it was, the beginning of something extraordinary. She never got any of it, and understanding why requires us to look honestly at the family she was born into and the systems that were supposed to catch her when that family failed. The house where Zoey Felix spent much of her short life sat on a southeast Topeka residential street that, like many corners of the city, carried the weight of decades of economic strain and community neglect. It was not a neighborhood that had been well served by the city's resources or the state's social safety net. It was the kind of street where people knew each other out of proximity and necessity, where front porches were stages for a continuous drama of daily survival, and where the sight of a small child wandering alone at odd hours was not something that shocked people but something that made them quietly, persistently worried. Holly Jo Felix, Zoey's mother, was 36 years old in 2023. Court records and news reports describe a household defined by instability. Substance abuse was alleged to be a factor in the home environment. Domestic disturbances were documented. Police had been called to the residence on multiple occasions. The home frequently lacked electricity and running water, basic utilities that most people take entirely for granted, and that no child should be forced to live without. The animal waste inside the residence was noted by people who visited the home as being pervasive enough to make the air inside almost unbreathable. According to records that would later surface in court filings and investigative reporting, Zoey's welfare had been a concern flagged to DCF for more than a year before her death. The investigations that followed those reports are a separate and deeply troubling chapter of this story. But what matters in understanding the home itself is simply this. It was not a place where a child could be safe. It was not a place where a child could be fed, clothed, bathed, or protected. It was, by every measurable standard, a home in crisis. Zoey's father, Mickel Felix, was also part of the picture, though the details of his relationship with Holly and the exact dynamics of their household are not entirely clear from public records. What is known is that he had legal custody of Zoey at the time of her death, not Holly, and that Mickel was the one who was present with Zoey in her final weeks of life. At some point in the summer of 2023, the situation at the house reached a breaking point. Holly Jo Felix reportedly kicked her husband and her two daughters, Zoey and Zoey's older sister, Katie, out of the home. The specific circumstances that led to this are not entirely clear from public records, and characterizing the internal dynamics of a deeply troubled household based solely on what surfaces in news reports would be irresponsible. What the records do show is the outcome: Mickel Felix, with his two daughters and a family acquaintance named Mickel Cherry, who had previously been living in the home, moved to a homeless encampment in a wooded area of southeast Topeka. A tent in the trees, no running water, no address, no mail, no front door. And no way for DCF investigators, who would later attempt 7 separate visits in September 2023 to locate the family and check on Zoey's welfare, to find them. The case was closed in September 2023. 3 days after the investigators gave up looking for the family, they were already gone from the house, and deep in the woods, Zoey Felix was dead. There is something almost unbearable about the precision of that timeline. The agency tried, then it stopped trying, and then the worst thing imaginable happened. That sequence of events, the trying, the stopping, the catastrophe, is one of the central failures that this case forced Kansas and the rest of the country to reckon with. But before we get to the failures of the system, we need to understand who Mickel Cherry was, where he came from, and how a 5-year-old girl ended up in his care on the last afternoon of her life. Mickel Cherry was 25 years old in October 2023. He had grown up in Texas, not Kansas, and by the time he found himself at the edges of Zoey Felix's life in Topeka, he had already accumulated a history that was, in almost every respect, a compounding record of abandonment, abuse, and institutional failure. According to documents filed by his defense attorneys in the Kansas Death Penalty Defense Unit, thousands of pages of records submitted to document what they called the mitigating events in Cherry's life. Mickel Cherry's childhood was one of profound neglect and violence. He was raised in a physically and emotionally abusive household. He did not receive the interventions that his condition required. He was diagnosed as a child with retinitis pigmentosa, an incurable and progressive genetic eye disease that causes gradual deterioration of the retina, and in most cases, eventually leads to full blindness. His defense team noted that Medicaid would have covered physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy, services he should have received and never did. He never completed high school. He was assessed as developmentally delayed. He had been placed in not 1, not 5, not 10, but 17 different foster homes during his childhood. He had spent time in 2 psychiatric hospitals. The Texas child welfare system, the system that should have intervened, should have stabilized him, should have provided the intensive support that a child with his specific combination of challenges desperately needed, failed him, repeatedly and comprehensively. Mickel has lived an extraordinarily difficult life, where he was first abused by his parents, and then by the system in place to protect children like him, wrote Peter Conley, a deputy defender with the Kansas Death Penalty Defense Unit, in a memorandum filed with the court. There is something strikingly, achingly parallel about that statement and what happened to Zoey Felix. Both of them, the 5-year-old girl and the 25-year-old man who would kill her, had been let down by the same kinds of systems. Both had fallen through the same kinds of cracks. Both had been assessed, flagged, investigated, and then left without meaningful intervention by agencies that were supposed to catch them before they hit the ground. Conley made this argument explicitly. The same system in Kansas, he wrote, allowed Zoey to fall through the cracks to allow her to be in a position of being babysat by a developmentally delayed homeless man from Texas. That argument was not made to excuse Cherry. His defense team was clear on that point. He bears full responsibility for what he did to Zoey Felix. The brutality of his actions cannot be attributed to his upbringing, his disabilities, or the failures of the state. But the question of how a 5-year-old girl came to be left in the care of a man like Cherry, isolated in a tent in the woods, with no other adult present, is a question that demands an honest answer. And that answer runs directly through every institution that looked at this situation and decided it didn't require urgent action. Within the household that preceded the homeless encampment, Cherry was known. He had lived in the Felix home on and off. Zoey knew him. She called him Uncle. That familiarity, that word, is one of the most painful details in this entire case, because it speaks to the trust that a 5-year-old extends instinctively to the adults around her, and the way that trust was betrayed with a violence that has no language adequate to describe it. By the time Ezekiel moved the family to the encampment in the woods of southeast Topeka, Cherry was part of the group. He was present. He was trusted, or at least he was treated as trustworthy enough to be left with Zoey while Ezekiel went to work. That is the arrangement that existed on October 2, 2023. And that arrangement is what cost Zoey Felix her life. The encampment sat in a wooded area near southeast Topeka, the kind of patch of land that cities have in their margins, not quite urban, not quite wild, screened from view by enough tree cover to make it possible for people to disappear there, at least for a while. Southeast Topeka is a neighborhood that has faced persistent economic hardship for decades, and it carries in its geography the quiet evidence of disinvestment. More vacant lots, more weathered storefronts, more people making do with less than the city's more visible districts. The tent that Ezekiel Felix, Katie, Zoey, and Mickel Cherry shared was, by any reasonable measure, not a place where a child should have been sleeping. But it was where they were, because the house they had come from was worse, condemned by city authorities, stripped of utilities, no longer habitable even by the forgiving standards that poverty so often enforces. And so the woods. Ezekiel Felix, whatever his failures as a father, and they were significant, was at least trying to provide in the most literal sense of the word. He went to work. On October 2, 2023, he left the encampment to go to his job, and he left Zoey in the care of Mickel Cherry. Katie, Zoey's older sister, was not at the camp when it happened. She returned in the late afternoon. The time was around 5:45 in the evening. She came back to the tent in the woods, and she found her 5-year-old sister half-clothed and unconscious on the ground inside it. The scream that came out of her in that moment is not something that has to be imagined. It was the kind of scream that comes from somewhere beneath words. She grabbed her sister. She called for help. Ezekiel, alerted, rushed back. A passerby joined the frantic effort to try to revive Zoey before emergency services arrived. Mickel Cherry was standing nearby, shirtless. There was dried blood near his navel. Emergency responders arrived at the gas station plaza area on SE 29th Street near the Dillons. Zoey was already being given CPR when they arrived. They took over. They worked on her. They rushed her to the hospital. The injuries to her lower body, the damage to her bladder, the catastrophic trauma consistent with severe SA, told the medical team everything they needed to know and gave them nothing they could work with. The harm was too extensive. The damage was beyond repair. Zoey Felix was pronounced dead. She had been 5 years old for as long as she was ever going to be. Mickel Cherry did not attempt to run. He did not construct a story. When Topeka police arrived and made contact with him, he said what he had done, and he said it plainly. "I did the unforgivable," he told investigators, "something I thought I would never do." He confessed to rapping 5-year-old Zoey Felix. He confessed to smothering her with a pillow to silence her after the assault. He described committing acts against a child who called him uncle, who trusted him, who would have had no framework for understanding what was happening to her body, no language for the terror of it, no ability to fight back against a grown man, and no one nearby to hear her if she called out. He was taken into custody. He was booked into the Shawnee County Jail at approximately 4:15 in the morning on October 3. His bond was set at $4 million, $2 million on each of the 2 charges that prosecutors would file, 1 count of first-degree murder in the commission of a felony, and 1 count of rape of a victim under the age of 14. Given the nature of the charges and the circumstances of the crime, prosecutors announced they would be pursuing the death penalty. The news broke across Kansas, and then across the country like something that moves through a community not as information, but as a blow. The kind of news that makes people put down whatever they are holding and stand still for a moment, unable to process it. A 5-year-old girl, a homeless camp, a man she called uncle, and a state agency that had investigated her family's situation at least 7 times in the year before she died without ever removing her from harm's way. The outrage was immediate, the grief was total. In the days following Zoey's death, Topeka community members gathered for vigils. Candles were lit in downtown Topeka. Flowers were brought to the gas station plaza near where she had been found. Her name was written in chalk on sidewalks. People who had never met her shared her photograph, that bright-eyed little girl in her mermaid shirt, across social media, and demanded that someone explain how this had been allowed to happen. A petition for justice in Zoey Felix's name gathered thousands of signatures. Child advocacy organizations began pushing publicly for a full accounting of DCF's handling of her case. Legislators were asked pointed questions they did not immediately have adequate answers to. And at 1350 KMAN, local radio brought the story to even more of the region as reporters began pulling at the threads of the case's backstory and finding, thread by thread, a pattern of failure that was both systemic and deeply specific. Because what happened to Zoey Felix was not, it turned out, a simple case of a monster doing the unthinkable. It was a case of a monster doing the unthinkable while every warning sign that the situation was becoming unthinkable had been plainly visible to the people who had the authority to act. The Kansas Department for Children and Families knew about Zoey Felix. This is not speculation. This is documented fact. According to court filings and investigative reporting from the Topeka Capital Journal and multiple other outlets, Zoey's welfare had been the subject of not 1, not 2, not 3, but at least 7 investigations by DCF in the year before her death. Some reports put an earlier number at 5 investigations across a broader timeline. The volume of concern being registered about this child by neighbors, by community members, by anyone who spent even a small amount of time near her block, should have been impossible to ignore. And yet, the agency's own internal assessment, according to court filings, determined that Zoey had only a slightly higher than average risk of being hurt or suffering lasting harm. That assessment, rendered while she was living in a condemned house without water or electricity, with adults who were allegedly involved in substance abuse and domestic violence, in a home that neighbors described as smelling of animal waste and functioning without basic utilities, determined that the risk was not high enough to warrant removal. In September 2023, as fall began to settle over Topeka, DCF investigators tried to locate the family 7 times. By then, the family had already moved. They were in the woods. They were in a tent. They were invisible to the agency because they had no fixed address and because the process that should have escalated the search, that should have triggered coordination with law enforcement to help locate a vulnerable child, either didn't exist in any meaningful way or wasn't followed. The case was closed. 3 days later, Zoey Felix was dead. The defense attorneys for Mickel Cherry made this argument most directly in their court filings, and while it was made in the context of arguing for leniency in sentencing, the substance of the argument holds. Had the agencies responsible for ZF's safety taken action by communicating, verifying information, and pursuing protective custody, her trajectory could have been different. She would not have been forced to live in a tent in the woods, nor left in the care of a traumatized person unfit to care for her. Her death, Conley wrote, was avoidable. The DCF did not disagree, exactly, but neither did it accept the full weight of responsibility that many community members and child advocates believed it should. The agency said that Zoey was never technically determined to be a child alleged to be in need of care under the specific statutory definition, and on those grounds, it initially declined to release the full reports from the investigations into her family. That technical dodge, that bureaucratic parsing of definitions, struck many observers as precisely the kind of institutional thinking that had put Zoey in danger in the first place. Child rights advocates were furious. Attorneys who specialized in child welfare law pointed to the case as a damning illustration of what happens when agencies interpret their mandates narrowly, when the bar for intervention is set too high, when the visible evidence of a child's suffering is filtered through a checklist rather than evaluated with human judgment. Kansans should be ashamed, wrote award-winning journalist Max McCoy in a widely circulated opinion piece published after Cherry's sentencing. The failures that contributed to the death of 5-year-old Zoey Felix did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a state with a fraying safety net, inadequate resources for homeless families, and an agency that was not equipped, or not willing, to pursue this child into the margins where she had been pushed. Neighbor after neighbor had called, report after report had been filed, and DCF had, each time, found a reason to determine that the situation didn't quite meet the threshold for intervention, that the risk was slightly elevated but not critically so, that the family was hard to locate but not impossible, that the investigation could be closed because the family had moved and the child was technically no longer at the last known address. What the agency's framework did not appear to account for was the fact that a child who disappears from her last known address into a homeless encampment in the woods is not a child whose risk profile has decreased. She is a child who has become invisible, and invisible children are the ones who are most in danger. Zoey Felix's death did not occur in a social vacuum. It occurred in a specific city, at a specific moment in that city's history, within a specific context of economic hardship and housing instability that shaped everything about the conditions that led to her death. Topeka, Kansas is a mid-sized city with a population of roughly 126,000 people. It is the state capital, and like many state capitals, it has a split identity, the gleaming dome of the State House on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end, neighborhoods like the one where Zoey grew up, where poverty and its companions have settled in across generations, and where the distance between those two worlds can feel almost oceanic. Homelessness in Topeka had been growing steadily in the years leading up to 2023. According to local government figures, there were 534 individuals experiencing homelessness in Topeka as of January 2025, an increase of more than 100 over the 2023 numbers. And nearly 1 in 5 of those individuals, the count showed, were under the age of 18. Children. Living in tents, in shelters, in vehicles, in encampments like the one in the trees of southeast Topeka, where a 5-year-old girl was left alone with a man she called uncle. The number of homeless students in Topeka and Shawnee County schools was estimated to be between 750 and 1,000. A figure dramatically higher than the annual point-in-time count, because homelessness among families with school-age children is often invisible in the ways that matter most. Children show up to school from motels, from cars, from the couches of extended family members. They are counted in the school data and missed in the street count. They exist in the gap between the systems designed to catch them. Zoey was not enrolled in school. She was 5 years old at the time of her death, which means she would have been starting kindergarten in the fall of 2023. Whether she ever began that school year, whether she was ever enrolled, whether any school system ever had eyes on her as a vulnerable child, these are questions that the available public record does not fully answer. But what the record does show is that she had no anchor in any institution that might have provided regular contact with a mandatory reporter, someone whose job required them to notice when a child was in distress and to act on that noticing. Her neighbors were not mandatory reporters. They were simply decent people doing what decent people do when they see a child suffering. But decency without institutional power can only stretch so far. They could feed her, clothe her, bathe her, give her a safe afternoon. They could not investigate her home. They could not remove her from danger. They could not compel the state to act. Only DCF could do that. And DCF did not. In October 2023, in the immediate aftermath of Zoey's death, Governor Laura Kelly publicly called for a reckoning. She pushed for legislation that would allow DCF to share information more transparently and in a more timely manner with law enforcement and other agencies. The idea was that if different agencies, DCF, police, other social services, could communicate more fluidly about the families they were each encountering, the gaps that allowed a child like Zoey to fall through might be narrowed, if not closed entirely. In 2024, Kansas legislators created a Child Advocate's Office, which for the first time would allow the public to receive a summary of what happened in cases where a child died in state custody, or where DCF had previous contact with the child. The agency also passed House Bill 2628, which established mechanisms for releasing information about individual cases where there was pressing legislative and public interest. These were meaningful steps. Child advocates acknowledged them as such, while noting that they were also long overdue, and that they came at a cost measured in the life of a 5-year-old girl who deserved protection long before any legislation was passed. DCF also noted that beginning in April 2026, it started contacting families every day of the week, including weekends and holidays, when there was a report from law enforcement that a child could be a victim of abuse or neglect. Previously, that contact was not guaranteed on nights and weekends. The gap between a report filed on a Friday afternoon and an investigator's first visit on a Monday morning is, in the world of child welfare, a gap measured not in days but in the irreversible things that can happen in days. The legal machinery of the state moved into motion in the days following Cherry's arrest, and from the start, it was clear that this was going to be one of the most significant criminal cases Kansas had seen in years. Cherry was charged on October 3, 2023 with 2 counts: first-degree murder in the commission of a felony, which is the statutory definition of capital murder in Kansas, and rape of a victim under the age of 14. Both charges carried the potential for the death penalty, and prosecutors announced that they intended to seek it. The bond was set at $4 million, $2 million per charge, and Cherry remained held in the Shawnee County Jail from the moment of his arrest. The case immediately attracted the attention of the Kansas Death Penalty Defense Unit, a specialized team of public defenders whose sole function is to represent defendants facing capital charges and to build the most comprehensive possible picture of mitigating circumstances. The facts about a defendant's background, history, and condition that a jury must weigh in deciding whether to sentence someone to death. The unit's involvement signaled the seriousness of what was to come, and the team began the painstaking work of reconstructing Mickel Cherry's life from its beginning. What they found was documented in thousands of pages of records and summarized in court filings that painted a portrait of a man who had, from childhood, been failed by virtually every system he encountered. The 17 foster homes, the 2 psychiatric hospitalizations, the untreated retinitis pigmentosa, the developmental delays, the abusive household he was born into. The Texas child welfare system that moved him from placement to placement without ever providing the sustained, intensive support his condition required. The absence of any secondary education, the absence of vocational training, the absence of the therapeutic infrastructure that might have given him tools for managing the trauma that had been accumulating inside him since childhood. Defense attorney Peter Conley argued in filings that Cherry was developmentally delayed and that his functional capacities were significantly impaired by both his neurological condition and his history of trauma. He argued that Cherry had never received adequate mental health treatment, never had stable housing as an adult, and had arrived in Topeka in a state of profound vulnerability, without resources, without support, and without the judgment that adequate intervention might have built in him over the years. None of this, to be absolutely clear, is a mitigation of what he did to Zoey Felix. The horror of what happened in that tent on October 2 does not diminish because of what happened to Mickel Cherry in Texas foster care facilities 15 years earlier. A 5-year-old girl was raped and murdered, Her killer knew what he was doing. He confessed to it. He called it what it was, unforgivable. But the defense's argument about mitigation was not presented as an excuse. It was presented as context, as evidence that the death penalty, the finality of state execution, was not the appropriate response to a crime that was, itself, the product of cascading failures across multiple systems over multiple years. The defense asked the court to take Cherry's background into account and to sentence him to concurrent rather than consecutive 25-year terms, an argument that, if accepted, would have made him eligible for parole after 25 years rather than 50. The case saw multiple continuances as the defense unit requested additional time to complete its investigation into Cherry's background. This is standard practice in capital cases, where the preparation of a comprehensive mitigation case is a constitutionally protected right, and one that requires extensive time, resources, and expert evaluation. The delays frustrated some observers, who felt that every continuance was another period of time in which justice for Zoey remained unresolved. In December 2024, more than a year after Zoey's death, Mickel Cherry appeared in Shawnee County District Court and entered a plea of guilty. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The deal meant that Cherry would face mandatory sentencing on the two charges, murder and rape, but that his life would not be taken by the state. It was a resolution that produced mixed reactions. For some advocates, the decision to forego the death penalty felt like a betrayal of Zoey's memory. For others, including those who had followed the evidence of Cherry's own profound childhood trauma, it was a recognition that the machinery of capital punishment cannot straightforwardly resolve the question of systemic failure that this case raised. For still others, the question of whether Cherry lived or died felt almost secondary to the broader question. What would Kansas do to make sure this never happened to another child? On July 15, 2025, Mickel Cherry appeared before a Shawnee County District Court judge for sentencing, nearly 2 years after Zoey Felix's death. The courtroom was not empty. These moments, the formal accounting of a crime so devastating, draw people who need to be present, who need to hear the words spoken aloud in a chamber that carries the weight of law, because only then does something that felt like a nightmare begin, in the most painful way imaginable, to feel real. Community members attended, reporters filled the press area, and members of Zoey's family were present, including the person whose presence in that courtroom was one of the most powerful and devastating elements of the entire proceeding. Katie Kane, Zoey's older sister, the teenage girl who had returned to the tent that afternoon and found her little sister unconscious on the ground, broke down. People magazine reported that Katie's reaction in the courtroom was the raw, unmediated grief of someone who had not only lost her sister, but had been the one to find her, the one who had carried that image for nearly 2 years, the one who had lived with the knowledge of what she had walked into on October 2, 2023. There is no word adequate for what it means to carry that. There is no sentence in this script, no phrasing elegant or careful enough to represent the weight of what Katie Kane has lived since that evening. She was a teenager herself. She should have been thinking about school and friends and the texture of ordinary life. Instead, she carries this. Prosecutors presented the case for consecutive sentences. The defense reiterated its argument for concurrent terms and pointed once more to the thousands of pages of records documenting Cherry's history of abuse and institutional abandonment. The judge listened to both arguments, considered the record before the court, and rendered a decision. Mickel Cherry was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 50 years before he would be eligible for parole. The judge imposed consecutive sentences: 25 years for the murder of Zoey Felix, 25 years for the rape of Zoey Felix, meaning that Cherry would have to serve both terms back to back, not simultaneously. He would be at least in his late 70s, if he lived that long, before any parole board would ever evaluate him. and his defense attorneys noted in the court filing. Another fact that carries its own grim weight. Cherry's retinitis pigmentosa will almost certainly progress during his incarceration. He will likely go blind in prison. The genetic eye disease that went untreated throughout his childhood, that no one in the system of care that processed him through 17 foster homes ever adequately addressed, will continue its slow and irreversible work inside him, in a prison cell, far from the Texas streets where it all began. It is not justice, journalist Max McCoy wrote in his reflection on the case. It is simply an unhappy fact in the jumble of unhappy facts of an unhappy life. As his defense attorneys said in their court filing, Cherry never stood a chance. Neither did Zoey. After the sentencing, Cherry was transferred into the custody of the Shawnee County Department of Corrections. He is classified as a violent offender. He will be incarcerated, barring parole after 50 years, for the rest of his functional life. In October 2023, as Topeka processed the news of Zoey's death in real time, the city's grief did not stay private. Community members organized a candlelight vigil in downtown Topeka, gathering in the cool October air to hold lights in memory of children who had been killed. Journalist Max McCoy attended that vigil and later noted a statistic that he described as gut-wrenching. At the time of Zoey Felix's death, fully 1/3 of all homicide victims in Topeka for the year 2023, 10 out of the total at that point, had been children. 1/3. In a city where a 5-year-old was being found in a tent in the woods, because no adult institution in her life had found a way to reach her. Flowers and candles appeared at the Dillon's gas station plaza on SC 29th Street. Social media filled with photographs of Zoey's face, that bright, inquisitive face, the mermaid t-shirt, the wide eyes, alongside demands for accountability. A Change.org petition for justice in Zoey's name garnered thousands of signatures. Child advocacy organizations, including groups specifically focused on protecting children in Kansas, used the case as a public call to action, demanding transparent investigations and meaningful reform. Topeka city leaders and community members gathered for organized responses. Local radio covered the ongoing developments extensively. The Topeka Capital Journal, the city's newspaper of record, dedicated significant resources to investigative reporting on the DCF failures and the broader context of child welfare in Kansas. Its coverage was recognized as among the most impactful journalism produced in Kansas in 2023, and it contributed directly to the legislative pressure that eventually produced some of the reforms that followed. National outlets picked up the story. NBC News, CBS News, ABC News, Oxygen, People Magazine, HuffPost, The New York Post, all covered Zoey's death and the details that emerged in its wake. The story traveled because it contained within it a set of questions that have no comfortable answers and that no responsible society can afford to look away from. What do we owe the most vulnerable children? What does it mean when a 5-year-old begs to stay at a neighbor's house because the alternative is going home? What does it mean that neighbors called and called and called and nothing happened? What does it mean that investigators tried to find a family 7 times and then stopped? These questions do not have easy answers, but they have to be asked, loudly and persistently, and with the full weight of Zoey Felix's name behind them. In the months following Zoey's death, Kansas entered a period of institutional self-examination that produced some genuine, if incomplete, reforms. Governor Laura Kelly's push for new transparency legislation bore fruit. House Bill 2628, passed during the 2024 Kansas legislative session, established for the first time a mechanism by which the public could receive timely information about individual cases of child death or serious harm, where there was significant public interest. Before this legislation, DCF's default position was to shield virtually all case information behind broad privacy protections, a stance that, as the Zoey Felix case made clear, could effectively prevent the public from ever learning how a child had been failed. The new law created a pathway, however limited, for accountability. The Kansas legislature also established a Child Advocate's Office, an independent body authorized to review cases where a child died in state custody or after contact with DCF, and to publish public summaries of what happened. This was a meaningful step. Independent oversight of child welfare agencies is essential, and its absence had been a chronic problem in Kansas. Having a structured mechanism for review and public reporting creates at least the possibility of systemic learning, of identifying patterns, gaps, and failures in a way that translates into policy change. DCF itself undertook an internal review and issued new policy guidance to child protection specialists and supervisors regarding when to contact law enforcement in cases where a child's welfare is at risk and the family cannot be located. This guidance directly addressed one of the most specific failures in Zoey's case: the fact that when investigators could not find the Felix family during their 7 September 2023 visits, they closed the case rather than escalating to law enforcement for assistance in locating the child. Beginning in 2026, the agency began contacting families every single day of the week, including weekends and holidays, when law enforcement had reported potential abuse or neglect. This change, modest as it might sound in isolation, addresses a real and documented gap in the system: the space between a Friday report and a Monday investigation, the window of time during which children in dangerous situations have no safety net. But not all of the proposed reforms made it through the legislature. DCF noted that it had also sponsored legislation that would have made it easier for homeless families like Zoey's to access additional services, legislation that could have reduced the likelihood of a family like the Felixes disappearing into a tent in the woods beyond the reach of any agency. The Kansas legislature did not take up those measures. They died in committee, or were deprioritized, or were simply not acted on, the familiar fate of legislation that asks something real of a state unwilling to fully fund the social infrastructure that vulnerable families need. The broader homelessness crisis in Topeka and across Kansas remains unaddressed at the structural level. More than 500 people were experiencing homelessness in Topeka as of early 2025, and nearly 20% of them were children under 18. The resources available to these families, shelters, support services, transitional housing, are inadequate to the scale of the problem. The One-Stop Resource Center established in Topeka offers something, but it can only serve families that are willing and able to seek help. For families in the kind of crisis that the Felix family was in, fractured, transient, substance-affected, unreachable by standard outreach, the safety net has too many holes. Janalia Randall, DCF's Director of Public and Government Affairs, acknowledged in a statement that Zoey's case reflects systemic challenges and the need for resources to help families that go beyond any one agency, such as assisting the homeless population. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it also risks diffusing responsibility so broadly that it becomes no one specific responsibility, a rhetorical move that advocates and journalists rightly pushed back on. Because the systemic challenges are real, and they are also specific. They include underfunded child welfare agencies with caseloads too large for any individual investigator to manage with care and rigor. They include statutory definitions of child in need of care that set the bar for intervention too high and leave too many children in dangerous situations without the legal basis for removal. They include inadequate interagency communication, so that a police officer who encounters a homeless child and a social worker who has filed an investigation on the same child may never speak to each other. They include a housing system so strained that families are pushed into encampments in the woods, and then told that the agency responsible for their children's welfare cannot locate them. None of this will be solved quickly. None of it will be solved by a single piece of legislation or a single internal review. But the conversation that Zoey Felix's death forced Kansas to have, publicly, loudly, in the pages of newspapers and in the chambers of the legislature, and in the glare of national attention, is the necessary beginning of something. And honoring her memory means insisting that the conversation continue, that the reforms be real rather than rhetorical, and that the next child who is begging a neighbor to let her stay gets heard before it is too late. On October 2, 2023, a little girl who loved mermaids and unicorns and asked 1,000 questions and demanded the answers was killed by a man she trusted, in a tent in the woods, while the state that was supposed to protect her had closed its file and gone home for the weekend. That sentence should be read slowly. It should be sat with, because every part of it, the mermaids, the questions, the tent, the closed file, matters. Each element is a piece of a system that failed, a person who looked away, an institution that chose process over a child's survival. Zoey Felix did not die because of a random, unforeseeable act of violence. She died in a context so thoroughly documented, so repeatedly flagged, so loudly raised by the neighbors around her that her death was not unforeseeable. It was, as Mickel Cherry's defense attorney put it in his court filing, avoidable. That word, avoidable, is the word that should be inscribed in the consciousness of everyone who makes decisions about child welfare policy, child welfare funding, and the conditions under which vulnerable families are left in the margins of American cities. Mickel Cherry is in prison. He will be there for at least 50 years. He will go blind in a cell in Kansas, serving sentences for the rape and murder of a child he called family. That is where the law has placed him, and that is where he belongs. But the accountability that Zoey's death demands cannot begin and end with one man. It has to reach into the institutions that looked at her situation across 7 investigations and saw a risk profile that was slightly higher than average. It has to reach into the legislative chambers where reforms stalled and funding was denied, and the homeless family with 2 children couldn't get access to the additional services that might have changed their trajectory. It has to reach into the specific decisions, the closed case, the missed visit, the Friday to Monday gap, and ask honestly and without bureaucratic deflection, how did this happen, and what will we do differently? Because there are other children out there right now, on other blocks in other cities, knocking on their neighbors' doors and asking if they can stay. Some of those neighbors will open their doors. Some of those neighbors will call the hotline. And somewhere in an agency somewhere, an investigator will look at the file and make an assessment of risk, and the word they write in the box, the number they assign, will determine whether a child goes home or goes somewhere safer. Zoey Felix went home. Over and over she went home. Until the day she didn't have a home to go to anymore, and she ended up in a tent, and nobody was looking for her, and she couldn't call for help loud enough for anyone to hear. She asked 1,001 questions and she demanded answers. That was who she was. That was the spirit of this little girl, blazing in a life that gave her almost nothing to work with. So the least we can do, the very least, as a community, as a society, as people who live alongside each other and are responsible to each other, is take those questions seriously. Ask them on her behalf, and refuse to accept as answers the same institutional shrugs and bureaucratic deferrals that sealed her fate. She was 5 years old. She deserved 1,000 more mornings.